to the Unique History channel. Today, we will be doing a book preview of the book Seeds of Empire, Cotton, Slavery, and the Transformation of the Texas Borderlands from 1800 to 1850. And it's by Andrew J Torget. It's published by University of North Carolina Press. And again, we don't endorse any of the political views of the author or publisher. So let's jump right in. Introduction: Cotton, Slavery, and Empire. Riding 2 stolen horses and a mule, 3 runaway slaves, Marion, Richard, and Tivy, waded across the Sabine River during the depths of winter in late 1819. Reasoning that the laws that made them slaves in the United States could not follow them into New Spain, the fugitives had escaped their master in western Louisiana, a cotton planter named James Kirkham, in hopes of making their way into the Spanish province of Texas. Carrying what little food they could, the runaways moved quickly to avoid the pursuit, following a scattered trail that ran through western Louisiana on its way into northern New Spain. Once across the river that marked the international border, the band pushed through dense forests of pines, oaks, and cedars as they continued west in search of new freedom and new lives. Not far beyond the Sabine, the runaways came upon a detachment of Spanish soldiers camped along the roadside, probably in hopes of asylum, and perhaps none of them knew the geography of the region. Marion, Richard, and Tivy marched into the camps and surrendered themselves. The troops took them into custody and escorted them 350 miles southwest to San Antonio, the Spanish capital, Texas, where they were presented to Governor Antonio Martinez. Lacking the resources to hold or feed them, Martinez soon decided to send the fugitives another 300 miles south to Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, where they could be housed and interrogated. The runaways soon had a chance to tell their story. Speaking through an interpreter with a clerk nearby to translate the exchanges, Spanish officers asked Marion, Richard, and Tivy why they had run away from the United States. One by one, the runaways recounted their escape from James Kirkham's plantation, defending their actions by describing the cruelty of their master. Richard testified that Kirkham's brutality pushed him across into Spanish territory because he wished for freedom, and Marion said much the same, recounting the very bad treatment that forced him to seek protection in the dominions of Spain. Tivy reported that Kirkham's wife was as vicious as her husband, promoting her to escape in the hopes that the Spaniards would treat her better. They were, as they explained, refugees of the expanding U.S. cotton frontier, and particular questions during the interrogations brought to the surface, if only momentarily, flashes of anger and pain they each felt about their enslavement. When Spanish officials asked Marion if he understood the financial damage he had caused his master by running away, Marion shot back that he was wrong too, and he was taken away from his relatives in South Carolina and sold to Kirkham's Louisiana plantation. Following their testimony, soldiers escorted the runaways to a nearby prison to await a decision on their fate by Monterey authorities, and as they waited, the man who claimed to own them made his way into northern New Spain. James Kirkham, having guessed where his slaves had gone, set out to reclaim them in November 1820, on the same road that guided Marion, Richard, and Tivy. As he crossed the Sabine River, Kirkham met another traveler, Moses Austin, also making his way into Texas. The two men decided to make the month-long ride to San Antonio together, setting out a journey that would become famous when Austin asked and received permission from the Spanish authorities to begin settling American families in Texas. Opening the territory to immigration from the United States would turn out to have momentous consequences, and Austin's ride to San Antonio has become widely known as one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the U.S.-Mexican borderlands. Indeed, Austin's proposal to offer Americans cheap land in northern New Spain has provided historians with an ever since an elegant shorthand for explaining the beginning of American movements into what would become the Mexican territory. a story so easily compressed into the fateful journey of a particular man. Yet Austen did not write alone, and the spectre of James Kirkham accompanying him in the pursuit of Marian Richard and TV points towards a larger, more complicated story surrounding that moment and its aftermath that has somehow been lost. More than Austen, Kirkham and the Runaways represented a broad and powerful changes, remaking the entire Gulf Coast of North America during the first half of the 19th century. Austen came to Texas, for example, because hundreds of thousands of men, like Kirkham, have already made their way into the southwestern edge of the United States through the late 1810s as a part of massive expansion of American cotton farming. Austen's plans to colonize Texas indeed depended on extending the cotton frontier beyond U.S. borders by convincing people like Kirkham to move their plantations into northern New Spain. Yet to make that happen, needed the Spanish government to approve more than just American immigration. He needed to endorse the enslavement of men and women like Mary and Richard and TV, since American farmers would not abandon the United States if they also had to abandon the labor system that made their cotton fields so profitable. That meant that opening the territory to American settlement would ultimately depend on this on the perspectives of Spaniards like Antonio Martinez and their own ideas about what cotton slavery and migration would mean for the region, as the design of Austen, Kirkham, or the Runaways. What was so remarkable about Austen's famous journey in the 1820s, as it turns out, was not the plan or actions of any single person. It was, rather, how that moment represented the convergence of forces, actors, and agendas from both sides of the Sabine River that would collectively remake a shared edge of the United States and Mexico. This is a book about the larger world that converged in that fatal ride to San Antonio and all the consequences that followed in its wake. It is the story of how powerful economic and political forces swirling throughout the northern Atlantic world crashed into one another during the first half of the 19th century, swept across North America, and transformed Mexico's northeastern frontier into the western edge of the southern United States. That process would in time redistribute power on the continent and remade its border as between the United States and Mexico, leaving both countries with enduring tensions that reverberate to this day. The seeds of that transformation and the journeys of Austen, Kirkham, and the Runaways to San Antonio have been sown into a quiet revolution in textiles that began when British industrialists had started feeding their machines cotton instead of wool. More comfortable, stylish, and affordable than its competitors, cotton cloth became a sensation by the 1800s. Within Britain's rapidly expanding commercial empire, English milliners as a result began buying it for much of the fiber as they could, as the plant became the most valuable commodities in the entire Atlantic world. The economic opportunities presented by this revolution in British textiles in turn prompted a flood of American farmers like Kirkham to pour into the territories that would become Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, where they established expansive new plantation districts in order to grow cotton for these ravenous markets. The result was an unprecedented expansion of the southern United States during the early decades of the 19th century, as the region rapidly transformed into the epicenter of international cotton production. At the same time, a small but growing contingent of anti-slavery activists rose to political prominence in the North Atlantic and pre-settled a terrifying challenge to American cotton farmers. This movement also traced its origins to the British Empire, where Quakers and Anglican evangelicals established anti-slavery societies during the late 18th century in an effort to pressure London to extract extricate Great Britain from the horrors of slavery. Politically active anti-slavery groups soon emerged on both sides of the ocean. By the early 1800s, Great Britain and the United States each allowed the international slave trade. By the early 1830s, aggressive anti-slavery forces had pushed a massive emancipation bill through the British Parliament. At the same moment, in the United States, abolitionists pulled new attacks on American slave owners in the U.S. Congress. Alarmed, alarmed, farmers in the American South struck back. Slave labor as the engine of their expansive new cotton economy. Enslaved people indeed made up more than 50% of the population of Mississippi by 1850, and so say pro-slavery forces in the U.S. South mounted their own militant defenses of the institution and its pivotal role in the expansion and prosperity of the southern United States. The result was one of the most consequential alignments of the 19th century. At precisely the same moment the Cotton Revolution made slave labor more profitable than ever, the rising power of global anti-slavery forces put that labor system under sustained political attack for the first time in human history. The remarkable confluence in turn produced a series of escalating battles between pro and anti-slavery forces that polarized politics within the United States and drove ever-widening divide between the northern and southern halves of the country. Those struggles accumulated with the secession of the South from the United States in 1860 to 1861 and the establishment of the Confederacy as a republic dedicated to defending slave-based agriculture in a world increasingly hostile to slave labor. Historians working on the efforts of the Cotton Revolution in North America as a result have focused on most of their attention on the internal development of the United States and the central roles that slavery and cotton played in creating political battles within the United States that led to the cataclysmic events of the American Civil War. Yet, the global forces that created the Confederacy washed over far more of North America than just the United States, and the profound changes that followed were never solely confined to the American experience. This book examines Texas borderlands as the far western front of the Cotton Revolution in North America, arguing that the same economic and political forces that created Mississippi and Alabama reached beyond U.S. borders and remade northeastern Mexico into the western edge of the American South. This wrenching changes that overtook this corner of the U.S.-Mexican borderlands in turn brought far-reaching consequences to both Mexico and the United States as the struggle over cotton and slavery helped reshape the wider continent. That process unfolded over the course of a tumultuous half-century. Although Spaniards had long claimed the territory they called Texas, by the early 1800s, the Spanish crown had failed in more than half a century to wrestle the region away from the Indian nations that controlled it. By the late 1810s, indeed, this borderlands territory served primarily as a profitable raiding ground for the vast Comanche Empire that stretched across both Texas and New Mexico. When Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, Mexican leaders opened the region to foreign colonization in a desperate bid to bring stability to their northeastern frontier by populating it. During the 15 years that followed, as tens of thousands of American expatriates poured into northern Mexico, the Texas borderlands rapidly shifted from entrenched Comanche territory to a thriving Anglo-Mexican Spanish state. Then, in 1836, a rebellion sheared Texas away from Mexico, and the Anglo-Americans rebuilt the territory once again as a newly independent nation. The sudden emergence of the territory, once again as a newly independent nation, isolated the region's Indians and ethnic Mexicans, set off pitched international conference between the United States, Mexico, and Great Britain over the future of North America. By 1845, those struggles, combined with the failure of the Texas nation, resulted in the annexation of Texas to the United States and set the stage for the U.S.-Mexican War. Although there were innumerable factors and people at play, the roiling turmoil of those decades could be traced to the powerful influence of three forces that combined to determine the ultimate fate of the region: the rise of the global cotton